Another reason why the term persons is used in reference to the slave population is that the framers of the federal Constitution were ashamed by the word slaves. Therefore, they expressed the idea by a circumlocution. We quote the language of a slaveholder which bears us out in this remark. Quote, "The Constitution guarantees to us the services of these persons." It does not say slaves, for the feelings of the framers of that glorious instrument would not suffer them to use that word on account of its anti-congeniality. Its incongeniality to the idea of a constitution for freemen. It says persons held to service or labor, unquote. This from a speech in Congress by Governor Wright of Maryland in 1822. Independently of every other kind of testimony, constant practice settles indisputably who are meant by the other persons. They are the slave part of the population. As a matter of fact, they are included in the census when the number of representatives from slave-holding states is to be determined. This is a practical interpretation of that part of the Constitution which cannot be misunderstood. There are now 25 additional representatives in Congress from slaveholding states in consequence of the adoption of the 3/5 principle. The expression other persons means slaves, and under the cover of this circumlocution, the federal Constitution recognizes the right of holding slaves. Nay, it does more. It provides a bounty for the increase of slavery. It violates the principles of representation by bestowing upon the domestic tyrant who holds hundreds of his fellow creatures in bondage an influence for making laws for free men proportioned to the number of his own slaves. Second, quote, "The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. This provision not only concedes the right of holding slaves by any of the states then existing, but also concedes the right of increasing their number of slaves by new importations." That from the United States Constitution, Section 9. The political squeamishness which induced the framers of the Constitution carefully to avoid the use of the word slave when fixing the ratio of representation appears in every part of it when slaves are referred to or meant. Instead of calling them by the name of slaves, which truly expresses the character given them by the Constitution, it speaks of them in this clause as persons that may be imported. In the first draft of the Constitution, the clause which corresponds to this provision was in these words, quote, "No tax or duty shall be laid, etc., on the migration or importation of such persons as the several states shall think proper to admit, nor shall such migration or importation be prohibited," unquote. This part of the draft being referred to a committee, they reported the clause in its present form, with the exception of the period when Congress should have the power of legislating on the abolition of the traffic, the committee having reported the year 1800. The extension from 1800 to 1808, the period finally fixed upon, was peremptorily insisted upon by South Carolina and Georgia as a condition of the Union. The Southern states would not trust this matter without restriction in the hands of Congress, lest Christian influence in the North might have prevailed in obtaining a speedy termination to the disgraceful traffic. By Southern influence, it was determined that Congress should not interfere with the foreign slave trade until the year 1808, 20 long years. Quote, "It was foreseen that the general power to regulate commerce would include a traffic now justly reprobated by most Christian nations, but some interests and opinions were to be respected, and while the power to abolish the slave trade entirely was indirectly conceded, the exercise of it till the year 1808, otherwise than by laying a tax or duty of $10 on each person imported, was prohibited," unquote. That from Rawle on the Constitution, page 113. A very erroneous opinion prevails respecting this part of the federal Constitution. It is considered as a prospective enactment by virtue of which the slave trade would cease in the year 1808. The object of this cause was to defer the abolition of the trade and put it beyond the constitutional power of Congress to touch the subject for 20 years. During this period, the Constitution not only decided that the traffic in slaves might be carried on, but that it should not be prohibited. And although Congress did abolish the foreign trade in slaves as soon as this infamous prohibition was removed, yet this clause remains and must remain while the federal Constitution exists as a foul stain and reproach on the national honor of the United States. Third, quote, No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom which service or labor may be due." Unquote. Constitution, Article 8, Sections 2 and 3. This provision of the Constitution, though it might include persons bound for a term of years, was designed solely to provide for the case of fugitive slaves, that they might be returned to bondage. Quote, "This clause," says Professor Story, "was introduced solely for the benefit of slaveholding states to enable them to reclaim their fugitive slaves who should have escaped into such states where slavery was not tolerated." Unquote. Commentaries on the Constitution, Volume 3, pages 676 and 677, by Professor Story of Harvard University. Here are three distinct provisions of the federal Constitution, all of them conceding to slaveholding states the right of holding unoffending men in bondage and using them as property. The first of these, while it concedes this right, confers the privilege of an increased representation in Congress upon slaveholding states in proportion to the number of their slaves, thus giving to slave property an advantage unknown to any other kind of property. The second held out to the slaveholding states the encouragement that the foreign trade in slaves should not be abolished for 20 years, during which period they might provide themselves to any amount with this kind of property. And the third secures to the slaveholder that no place within the jurisdiction of the United States shall be an asylum to the fugitive slave. A provision in direct violation of the equitable precept given by God to the Hebrews, quote, "Thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which is escaped from his master unto thee. He shall dwell with thee, even among you, in that place which he shall choose, in one of thy gates where it liketh him best. Thou shalt not oppress him." Unquote. Deuteronomy 23, verses 15 and 16. We have now shown that slavery is recognized by the federal Constitution, and thus we have another proof of the national guilt. The United States are chargeable with the sin of slavery. Those who hold the opinion that the amendment to the Constitution which says, quote, "No person shall be deprived of liberty without due process of law," unquote, constitutionally destroys slavery in the United States, proceeds on the assumption that the federal Constitution is in every respect consistent with itself. This, however, is not the fact. The framers of the Constitution had two objects in view, which it was impossible to bring together consistently in one instrument: a liberal constitution of national government, founded on republican principles, with a recognized right of retaining a certain class of persons in slavery. The northern states would have readily conceded to all the right which they claimed for themselves, that of being free men. The southern states, while they claimed this right, would not agree that all should partake of it. They insisted upon an exception, that the laborers of the South should be denied the blessings of freedom. To secure the adoption of the Constitution and unite the states in one national confederation, the North compromitted the principles of liberty. We shall conclude this article by giving some quotations from a distinguished writer on the federal Constitution, which corroborate the view which we have now given. Quote, The truth is that the arrangement adopted by the Constitution, the 3/5 principle, was a matter of compromise and concession, confessedly unequal in its operation, but a necessary sacrifice to the spirit of conciliation which was indispensable to the union of the states, having a great diversity of interests in physical condition and political institutions. Unquote. Quote, "In fact, it cannot escape the attention of every intelligent reader that many sacrifices of opinion and feeling are to be found made by the Eastern and Middle States in the peculiar interests of the South." Unquote. It was notorious that the postponement of an immediate abolition was indispensable to secure the adoption of the Constitution. It was a necessary sacrifice to the prejudices and interests of a portion of the Southern states. And here a footnote. That from Story's Commentaries on the Federal Constitution, Volume 2, page 111, and page 677, as well as Volume 3, page 204. It has now been made evident that slavery is a national sin, and that, as far as the northern states are concerned, this sin was submitted to as a compromise to the southern states for advantages gained by the former. Quote, "It had a material influence in reconciling the southern states to other provisions in the Constitution, and especially to the power of making commercial regulations by a mere majority, which was thought peculiarly to favor the northern states." Unquote. That from Story's Commentaries on the Federal Constitution, Volume 2, page 113.